The year was 1940, and Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering, standing at the height of his power, made a boast that would haunt him for the rest of history. With a glass of champagne in hand, he looked out over the heavy industrial heartland of the Ruhr and declared to the German people, "No enemy bomber can reach the Ruhr. If one reaches the Ruhr, my name is not Goering. You may call me Meyer." For years, the Luftwaffe rode good on that promise. While British night bombers struck in the dark, the daylight skies over Berlin belonged to the Iron Cross. The equation of the air war was simple and brutal. Allied bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress were deadly, but they were vulnerable. To protect them, the Allies sent fighter escorts, Spitfires and P-47 Thunderbolts. But these fighters had a fatal flaw. They were short-legged. They guzzled fuel. German pilots knew the turning point by heart. They knew the exact line on the map, usually around the city of Aachen or the Rhine River, where the American fighters would have to wiggle their wings, bank 180 degrees, and fly home before their tanks ran dry. Once the fighters turned back, the slaughter began. The German Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs would rise up like wolves pouncing on a defenseless flock of sheep. For the B-17 crews, the flight to Berlin was a suicide run. For the Luftwaffe, it was a turkey shoot. But in the freezing winter of early 1944, a ghost appeared on the radar screens. It started as a rumor. German radar operators picked up contacts accompanying the bomber streams far deeper than should have been physically possible. At first, High Command dismissed the reports. "It's a radar echo," they said. "It's a mistake." They believed it was scientifically impossible for a single-engine fighter to carry enough fuel to fly from England to Berlin and back, let alone fight a battle in between. Then came March 6, 1944. A massive armada of American bombers headed for the capital. The Luftwaffe scrambled everything they had, confident that they would meet the bombers alone over the city. Adolf Galland, the general of fighters, was on the ground monitoring the radio frequencies. He expected to hear the usual confident hunting calls of his pilots. Instead, he heard panic. "Indians! Indians over Berlin!" the voices screamed through the static. "Fighters! Single-engine fighters!" Up at 25,000 feet, the veteran German aces looked out of their canopies and froze. They saw small, slim, silver aircraft dancing around the heavy bombers. These planes didn't have the radial engine of the Thunderbolt or the elliptical wings of the Spitfire. They had a square-tipped wing and a shark-like radiator scoop under the belly. They were North American P-51 Mustangs. The German pilots watched in horror as these ghosts did something impossible. They dropped external fuel tanks from their wings, silver teardrops falling toward the earth, and then, instead of turning back, they accelerated. The P-51s didn't just have the range, they had the performance. They tore into the German formations. The Luftwaffe, heavy with armor and cannon to kill bombers, suddenly found themselves in a knife fight with a plane that was faster, more agile, and flown by pilots who knew they had technological superiority. The psychological impact was devastating. On the ground, when reports reached Hermann Goering that American fighters were strafing the streets of Berlin, he initially refused to believe it. "They must be phantom planes," he reportedly shouted. "They cannot be there." But the wreckage didn't lie. The Mustang had shattered the fundamental rule of the air war. The safe zone over Germany was gone. There was no longer anywhere to hide. The roof of the Third Reich had been blown off. For the Luftwaffe pilot, the appearance of the Mustang was the beginning of the end. They realized with a sinking heart that the enemy had solved the impossible engineering puzzle of range versus performance. The ghost was real, and it had come to destroy them. The day the Mustang arrived over Berlin was the day the German pilots realized that courage alone would no longer be enough to save them.
By the late spring of 1944,
The German High Command was in a state of technical panic. The P-51 Mustang was tearing the heart out of the Luftwaffe, destroying their fighters and escorting bombers all the way to Berlin. But to the German engineers in Berlin, the Mustang was a riddle they could not solve. How did it fly so far? How was it so fast? How did a plane with an American engine and a British design philosophy outperform the best engineering the Third Reich could produce? They had piles of scrap metal. They had Mustangs that had crashed in forests, burned in fields, or exploded in mid-air. But twisted aluminum tells no tales. You cannot test fly a wreck. To unlock the secret, the Luftwaffe needed a miracle. They needed a Trojan horse, a perfect, functioning enemy machine brought right into their hangar. On June 7, 1944, just one day after the D-Day landings in Normandy, they got their wish. The incident occurred at the Cambrai-Epinoy airfield in France. First Lieutenant Thomas Fraser, flying a P-51B, was returning from a patrol. The chaos of the invasion was absolute. The skies were crowded, radio channels were jammed, and navigation was a nightmare. Disoriented and running critically low on fuel, Fraser spotted a concrete runway below. It looked safe. It looked like salvation. He dropped his landing gear and touched down smoothly. As the P-51 taxied to a halt and the propeller spun down to silence, Fraser slid back the canopy, expecting to see a welcoming American or British ground crew. Instead, he saw field gray uniforms. He saw coal scuttle helmets. He saw the barrels of Mauser rifles pointed at his cockpit. He had landed at an active Luftwaffe base. Fraser attempted to escape, but it was hopeless. The pilot was captured, but for the German technical officers on the base, the pilot was secondary. The prize was the machine. The ground crews were ordered not to damage a single rivet. They pushed the pristine Mustang into a hangar, hiding it from Allied reconnaissance planes. When the engineers from the Rechlin Erprobungsstelle, the German equivalent of Area 51, arrived, they looked at the aircraft with a mix of awe and envy. They immediately noticed the smooth finish. This was the secret of the Mustang's laminar flow wing. The wings were not just shaped differently, they were built with a precision that German factories, now under constant bombing, could no longer match. The surface was puttied and sanded to aerodynamic perfection, reducing drag to levels the Germans thought impossible. The aircraft was quickly seized by the second Staffel of the Versuchsverband Oberbefehlshaber der Luftwaffe, a unit better known as the Zirkus Rosarius, a special unit tasked with testing captured enemy aircraft and training German pilots on how to fight them. But first, the Trojan horse had to be branded. In a surreal transformation, the white American star was painted over. On the fuselage and wings, the mechanics painted the Balkenkreuz, the black and white German cross. On the tail, where the serial number used to be, they painted a black swastika. But the most striking change was the underbelly. To ensure that German anti-aircraft gunners didn't shoot down their own prize, the entire underside of the Mustang, including the tail, was painted a vibrant, screaming yellow. The plane was given the code T9 plus CK. As the engine roared to life, a Packard V-1650 Merlin, the heartbeat of the enemy, the German test pilots gathered around. They were about to take the American Eagle into the German sky. They hoped to find a weakness, a fatal flaw they could exploit to save their country. Instead, as they taxied T9 plus CK onto the runway at Rechlin, they were about to discover that the Trojan horse contained a devastating truth. They were fighting a war against a machine they could not replicate and a technology they could not beat. The weapon was now in their hands, but it would only serve to confirm their impending defeat. In the secret hangars of Göttingen,
The pride of the Zirkus Rosarius, the Luftwaffe's elite test unit, sat gleaming under the harsh electric lights. It was a P-51B Mustang, code T9 plus CK. Its belly had been painted a screaming, vibrant yellow, a desperate signal to German flak gunners, "Do not shoot. This one belongs to us." To the German aces gathered around it, the machine looked less like a weapon of war and more like a piece of industrial art. They were used to the rugged, angular brutality of the Messerschmitt 109 or the Focke-Wulf 190. But this American machine was smooth. Its aluminum skin was flush-riveted, polished to a mirror shine to reduce drag on its laminar flow wings. Oberleutnant Hans-Werner Lerche, a veteran test pilot, walked around the aircraft, running a gloved hand over the leading edge of the wing. He turned to the lead engineer. "It's too smooth," he muttered. "How do they mass-produce this quality? We can barely finish a cowl without gaps, and they build this by the thousands." But the real shock awaited inside. Climbing into a Bf 109 was a claustrophobic experience. The cockpit was narrow, cramped, and cluttered, essentially a metal coffin strapped to a massive engine. The pilot sat with his knees up, surrounded by jagged levers and protruding gauges, brined to the rear. Lerche stepped onto the wing of the Mustang and slid back the canopy. He lowered himself into the seat and paused. Space. The cockpit was enormous compared to German fighters. It felt less like a fighter plane and more like a luxury sedan. The instrument panel was logically arranged, clean and intuitive. There was a floor. There was room to move his elbows. He looked around. The visibility was breathtaking. Unlike the birdcage framing of the Bf 109 that obstructed the view, the Mustang offered a commanding view of the sky. "It is like sitting in an armchair," Lerche called down to the ground crew, his voice tinged with disbelief. He reached for the controls. Everything fell naturally to hand. The Americans had thought of everything. There were ashtrays. There were holders for maps. But the most damning feature was the heating system. At 30,000 feet, German pilots often froze in their cockpits, fighting frostbite as much as the enemy. The Mustang had a dedicated, powerful heater. A sinking feeling settled in Lerche's stomach. This wasn't just an airplane, it was a statement of industrial philosophy. The Germans built planes for maximum performance at the expense of the pilot. The Americans built planes that kept the pilot fresh, warm, and alert, knowing that a comfortable pilot kills more enemies than an exhausted one. He signaled the ground crew to clear the prop. He primed the engine. The massive Packard V1650 Merlin roared to life. It didn't cough or sputter. It hummed with a deep, throaty resonance. The vibration was minimal. As Lerche taxied the yellow-bellied prize out to the runway, the realization hit him harder than any enemy bullet. The propaganda ministries in Berlin screamed about decadent Americans and their inferior mass-produced junk. But sitting in this cockpit, feeling the effortless power of the throttle and the comfort of the seat, Lerche knew the lie. They weren't fighting a clumsy giant. They were fighting an enemy that had mastered the perfect balance of man and machine. The Luftwaffe was sending exhausted boys in cramped, freezing metal boxes against well-rested men in heated, high-performance chariots. He lined up on the runway and pushed the throttle forward. The Mustang leapt eagerly into the German sky, a captured eagle that handled better than anything the Reich had ever built. As the ground fell away, Lerche felt a profound sense of doom. If the Americans could build thousands of these, he thought, the war was already over. The engineering gap wasn't just in the metal, it was in the mind, and Germany had already lost.
The sky over the Rechlin Test Center was a piercing, unforgiving blue. It was the perfect canvas for a duel that would decide the fate of the Luftwaffe.
But this battle would not be fought with bullets. It would be fought with data, stopwatch timings, and the sweat of the Reich's best pilots. On the tarmac sat two machines. On the left, the pride of German engineering, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6. It was a predator, angular, cramped, and brutally efficient. On the right sat the intruder, the captured P-51B Mustang T9+CK, its belly painted that humiliating bright yellow. The pilot strapping into the Messerschmitt was a veteran ace. He knew his machine intimately. He knew that the Gustav could climb like a rocket. He believed, as he had been told by Goebbels' propaganda, that the American plane was a heavy, clumsy cruiser built for comfort, not for the violent aerobics of a dogfight. The engines roared to life. The two fighters tore down the runway and lifted into the German air. At first, the German pilot felt a surge of confidence. As they pulled back on the sticks to climb to 20,000 feet, the Messerschmitt surged ahead. The lightweight German fighter clawed for altitude with a ferocity the Mustang couldn't match. "We have them," the German thought. "If we catch them climbing, they are dead." But the test protocol called for a high-speed engagement. They leveled off. The radio crackled, commencing high-speed dive and maneuvering test. Both pilots shoved their throttles forward. The noses dropped. The speedometers began to wind up. 300 miles per hour, 350, 400. This was the realm where physics changed. This was where the air turned solid. Inside the Messerschmitt, the German pilot felt the familiar, terrifying stiffening of the controls. As the speed crossed 400 miles per hour, the air pressure on the control surfaces became immense. The stick, usually light and responsive, turned into a rod of iron. He had to use both hands and all his strength just to keep the plane steady. Rolling the aircraft required a Herculean effort. The Bf 109 had become a brick. He looked over his shoulder, expecting to see the Mustang struggling with the same laws of physics. What he saw stopped his heart. The Mustang was there, glued to his tail, but the American plane wasn't struggling, it was dancing. While the German pilot was wrestling with a frozen stick, the American pilot was effortlessly banking, rolling, and tracking him. The Mustang's advanced control surfaces and servo tabs cut through the heavy air like a razor. "Brake right," the radio commanded. The German pilot hauled on the stick with both hands, his veins popping, forcing the heavy Messerschmitt into a sluggish turn. The Mustang simply pivoted. It cut inside the German's turn radius with terrifying grace. In a real battle, the German realized with a cold sweat, he would already be dead. The American pilot could have put a burst of .50 caliber fire into his cockpit 3 times over. They repeated the test. They tried dives. They tried high-speed yo-yos. The result was always the same. At low speeds, the German plane was dangerous, but at high speeds, the speeds where modern air combat actually happened, the Mustang was supreme. It retained its handling. It remained a weapon, while the Messerschmitt became a projectile. When they finally touched down and the props spun to a halt, the German pilot climbed out. He was soaked in sweat, his arms aching from fighting the controls. He walked over to the group of engineers standing by the yellow Mustang. He looked at the American machine, then back at his own beloved Messerschmitt. The denial was gone. The propaganda was gone. There was only the cold, hard engineering truth. "At high speed," the ace reported quietly, removing his flight cap, "it handles like a sports car. My 109 handles like a truck." The report filed that day at Rechlin was dry and technical, but its meaning was a eulogy. It admitted that while a German pilot might escape a Mustang by climbing, he could never outdive it and he could never outturn it once the fight got fast. The Luftwaffe had spent years telling their pilots they flew the superior machines. That afternoon at Rechlin, the pilots learned the truth. They were flying obsolete metal against the future of aviation.
The typewriter keys clacked in the quiet administrative office of the Rechlin Test Center, each strike hammering another nail into the coffin of the Third Reich. It was late 1944. The test flights were over. The captured P-51 Mustang T9 plus CK had been flown, dissected, and pushed to its limits by Germany's best pilots. Now there was nothing left to do but write the truth. The resulting document was known simply as the Rechlin Report. It was a dry, technical assessment filled with graphs, drag coefficients, and fuel consumption charts. But to the men who understood what the numbers meant, it was a terrifying prophecy of doom. Oberst Edgar Peterson, the head of the test center, reviewed the findings. The conclusions were inescapable. The report stated in cold, clinical German military language that the American fighter was aerodynamically superior to the standard Messerschmitt Bf 109 and Focke-Wulf 190 in almost every metric that mattered. The report highlighted the laminar flow wing, noting its incredible efficiency. It praised the Packard Merlin engine's reliability. It noted the fuel capacity that allowed the enemy to loiter over Berlin for hours, while German interceptors had to land after 45 minutes. But the most damning section was on high-speed handling. The report admitted that at the combat speeds determining life or death, speeds over 400 miles per hour, the German planes stiffened and became sluggish, while the Mustang remained agile and lethal. When this report traveled up the chain of command to the Reich Air Ministry in Berlin, it was met with a mixture of shock and denial. For years, the Nazi propaganda machine had preached that German engineering was the finest in the world, that the Aryan race produced superior machines. The Rechlin Report shattered that illusion. It proved that the mongrel nation of America had produced a weapon of war that was simply better. Adolf Galland, the general of fighters, read the reports and came to a grim conclusion. The era of the propeller was over. He realized that Germany could not tweak the Bf 109 anymore. They couldn't add more cannons or bigger engines to the Focke-Wulf Gun 90 without making them too heavy to fly. The design limits had been reached. The Mustang was the pinnacle of piston engine technology, and Germany had nothing to match it on the production line. This report became the catalyst for desperation. It drove the frantic, reckless push for the Messerschmitt Me-262 jet fighter. The logic was brutal. If we cannot beat the Mustang with a propeller, we must change the game entirely. We must fly without propellers. The wonder weapons were not born of confidence. They were born of the terror instilled by that yellow-bellied Mustang. But it was too late. The report had quantified the impossible gap. As the papers were filed away in the archives, the skies outside continued to fill with the roar of American engines. The German commanders knew the truth now. Every time they looked at a map and saw the red lines of Allied bomber streams protected by the little friends, they remembered the report. The bitter truth was not just that the Mustang was a good plane. It was that the enemy had mastered the art of war production and design. The Rechlin Report didn't just analyze an airplane, it diagnosed the terminal illness of the Luftwaffe. The ghost over Berlin had become a solid, unbeatable reality, and no amount of willpower or propaganda could change the aerodynamic facts. The war was lost. The Mustang had won.